Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. This podcast is brought to you thanks to the generous support of Eutelsat, EchoStar, Hughes, and Access Intelligence. Additional support comes from the 3,000 members of Space and Satellite Professionals International and its chapters around the world. Thank you, SSPI. Today, we continue with our Risk series. This second season of Risk is sponsored by Kymeta, Mansat, and OneWeb satellites. Please thank them by doing business with them whenever you can. James Hines is the Chief Executive Officer of Airbus OneWeb Satellites, appointed by the Board of Directors in January of this year. Mr. Hines is a proven leader with 3 decades of leadership and engineering experience. In his role here, he is responsible for leading approximately 300 employees in France and Florida, overseeing the advanced satellite manufacturing facility of Airbus OneWeb satellites. Now, for our listeners who do not know this, it's a joint venture between Airbus and OneWeb, created to design the satellites for OneWeb's low Earth orbit constellation at a production rate up to 2 per day. I'll repeat that, a production rate of 2 satellites per day. So no adverse pressure there, huh? As you might imagine, in this episode of Risk, we're going to look at how risks are managed in both secure and new unexpected environments and conditions. Of course, COVID-19 presents an extreme adverse challenge to the space and satellite community, and we may get into that a little bit. We'll explore with James his general view of how to best overcome and manage through unexpected adversity. James, welcome to the Better Satellite World.
So thank you very much, Lou. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to all those out there who are going to listen. And I think it's a great time when we can actually learn from each other's experience. And, you know, there is one certainty in life, isn't there? That there is uncertainty, which is risk. And how do we actually go to manage that in a way which can actually ensure that we deliver? So yes, thank you, Lou. It's a great topic. It's a shame we've only got 20 minutes or so to talk about it, because we could easily generate a whole week, if not more, on the topic. But I hope that we will summarize some key points and hopefully points of discussion going forward. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and you're very, very wise to understand that risk and change is sort of the constant in life. I think it's the first thing that you need to recognize. And so, again, congratulations on your new appointment as CEO of Airbus OneWeb Satellites. I think the first question people have, it's going to sound like 2 questions, James, but it's really one, is how is Mr. Hines going to manage the confidence of his board and the company's investors in general? And how do you plan to do all this in a time of a global pandemic, as if there aren't enough challenges?
Yeah, there are indeed 2 great questions. I think the first is fairly straightforward. How am I going to manage the confidence of the board and the company's investors in general? You know, our business is no different from many businesses. You need delivery, and you need delivery at the points in terms of schedule, obviously in terms of price, but also in terms of quality. So all of those aspects come together in terms of what the board is expecting me to do. I would say there's another element to it as well, which is obviously with the platform which has been developed and has been produced, over 100 launched last year, is something where we can build on that. And there are other business opportunities which arise. So my primary focus at the moment is making sure that we have what we call a generation 1 for OneWeb built and launched, but also I'm looking at how we can use what we have here in terms of a spacecraft design, which has been put together for mass production, and a set of processes, including robotics and cooperative machining, how they all come together to change the process, and how they change the process as one bigger family, not purely the folks working here in Florida, which is where I'm based most of the time, but also our sister organization where we have most of our engineering resources in terms of development, both for the product and process in Toulouse, France, and also with that bigger family which is our supply chain, and also, of course, very much so, our shareholders, Airbus and OneWeb. How do we all work together to face these challenges? And I think that's a good introduction into the next question, which is the global pandemic. Now, the global pandemic is immensely tragic, and words cannot really summarize, what this has meant to so many people, so many communities, families around the world, and our general way of living. It's a real tragedy, but it's a circumstance, and it's a circumstance which has affected our organization, because obviously we have a global supply chain. As I just mentioned, we have two significant organizations in the USA and France. We have a customer in the UK. So one of the simplest things which has affected us is the ability to travel. And how do we overcome that? So as with many people, we have a lot more video meetings, and we have to work out, how do we actually work together in an environment where we can't assume you will meet someone face to face. And I think that is still an important element of human nature. You want to talk to people, you want to be with them, but we have to kind of like move past that. So that's been one of the challenges. Another challenge is quite simply, when you go out to your workplace, when you go to your restaurant, if there are restaurants open in your particular country, and in the UK and France, they're not. But if you go to those environments, you need to have your personal protective clothing, your masks, and you need to be keeping distancing. And everything you do outside of the workplace, we have to do inside the workplace. So one of the biggest challenges to us is how to actually keep the machine, meaning our factory and our support organization, working when we have to respect all of these criteria, not because it's law, but because it's good social practice with our colleagues, with our friends, with our families. So that's been another challenge which we've met. And we've done a number of measures, such as testing every 2 weeks, making sure we've got plastic barriers, everything you might see at the bank or a convenience store or your grocery store. We've brought in those good measures to try and manage the fact that we still have to make this factory run, because our customer expects the product to be delivered, again, in this case, satellites, but they expect it to be delivered in an environment where we really are challenged in terms of respecting each other in terms of COVID-19. So, yep, it's a huge challenge, but I would say the last thing here, Lou, is the fact it's a challenge. And, if it wasn't COVID-19, it could well be another challenge. And if we look back through history, just in the near term, there have been other challenges which affect organizations. But clearly, this is one which has really, really affected everyone at their core, and it's done it over a very long period of time. But we're responding to it, both in terms of the factory and that bigger family of people who I mentioned.
Well, and I really appreciate that your thinking on that is to kind of, I suppose, normalize it in a way. It's a challenge. It's one that got thrown at us, and like other industrial platforms, we're going to manage around it, like society at large. Of course, the only difference is we're putting satellites together.
Yeah.
I heard you say in your remarks, James, that there are probably some new processes that have evolved from the manufacturing of the satellites. Was there a concern, just to stay on the pandemic for a second, was there a concern that the pandemic would upset those processes? And was your first sort of staying awake at night thought that, gee, my supply chain really could get disrupted here. I need to figure that out quickly? Or was that something that had already been taken care of by the time you got in?
No, it's a great point. And, simple truth is that when the impact COVID-19 has had on travel for both people and goods, it had all the potential for really disrupting our supply chain. And sadly, I don't think you've mentioned it, Lou, we also had the situation where we had to come through Chapter 11 of OneWeb last year, but it's something we did with strength. And that was another factor. And it's, an illustration if it's something which is built on COVID-19. So to answer your very first question, we had to work out, exactly how we develop our supply chain. How do we look at the logistics? Because we had a simple issue that, you've got fewer aeroplanes flying between Europe and the US. And so the few aeroplanes which are still flying are more loaded with freight. And so if you don't get a regular slot on those planes, you're going to delay the equipment coming over. We also had to think about our suppliers. Many of them were having the same issues in terms of still having to keep the factory running. In some cases, lower tier suppliers who had issues. So we had to work together to look at all those various challenges at the very simplest of levels. But another thing I wanted to share is over here in Florida, and indeed in Toulouse, there was a strange benefit, and you rarely hear that word associated with Chapter 11 or COVID-19.
Right.
And it was a simple element that we had started production, we had delivered the first 2 batches, and then we had this period where we had to slow the factory down. I say slow, we didn't shut the factory, we slowed it down as we faced up to these adversities. And this is actually, when I reflect on it, is a very good element that we managed to slow ourselves down and think about the situation we were in and how to make ourselves stronger. So what we did is we looked at the various processes, we talked about supply chain, but in addition, we looked at all of those processes around our factory. How do we ensure engineering review data? How do we ensure that test software scripts, which are used to automatically validate a part of the spacecraft or the in-spacecraft, how can they do it more efficiently? How can we get the robots to work 100% of the time as opposed to 75% of the time? So we actually managed to use that time to improve our processes. So when we came out completely of Chapter 11 and managed to pull the factory back up to a more nominal rate for batch 3 and batch 4, we found that we were significantly more advanced on the continuous improvement scale than we would have been if we'd have just kept producing, because we had a chance to stop, look around, see what the issues were, and then apply critical resources to that area. And sorry to interrupt, Lou, there was another fringe benefit, is that with all of the difficulty of COVID and Chapter 11, people were actually able to think, this is really interesting work, and I see that I'm actually changing something for the better. So that's, it was very interesting to me how that happened.
It really is, and it's those unintended consequences that, as you said earlier, turn out to be benefits. People just, using their creativity and responding to adversity in positive ways. Again, not every organization can do that. I don't want to, tell our audience out there that's the easiest thing in the world to do. There's an awful lot of work and sweat in what you just described, and I think you've described it wonderfully. James, what would you say is the one experience or maybe something in your life which teaches you or taught you about the nature of adversity and what it can do to a person, a leader in an organization, similar to what you've just been describing?
I would struggle to give you one experience, but that was what you asked. So a lot of the elements I could give you would be around delivery, and that would surprise no one. I've worked in operations, I've been a project manager, and now I look after this company. So a lot of the elements in terms of adversity are when you face the topic of delivery and what you have to do to make that happen. And I've also talked about the environment, which you don't always have a lot of control over, such as COVID-19. But I'm going to give you another example, just to really give you a little bit of me. I really love sailing. And, I come from originally Portsmouth in England. You can probably tell by my accent, at least the English part of it.
No.
And, Portsmouth is very much a naval and a sailing city.
Sure.
And being in Florida at Cape Canaveral, Cocoa Beach, there is also a good element of water and sailing around. But I'm going to give you an example from those experiences, which will really bring out this topic of adversity and how we react to it. And the incident is it happened in Greece about 3 or 4 years ago. I was sailing with some friends in the Mediterranean, and we'd had a beautiful day of sailing. The sun was shining, the right amount of wind, and we came back into the harbour. And as we got into the harbour, we were slowly manoeuvring, and then someone said, "You have wrapped the rope of the anchor around the propeller of the boat."
Oh.
And any of you out there who are sailors will know that's you don't want to do that, and it's a pretty difficult situation to get out of. So we'd wrapped a bit of the anchor rope around the propeller. Now, what you have to do is you have to basically free the rope from the propeller. So that was definitely an adverse situation. We managed to solve that one by one of our crew going underneath the boat, I think at least 20, if not 30 times, to just hack away with a knife these bits of rope. And you have to do that. But to add to the complexity, what we hadn't realized is that we'd actually managed to pick up a 100-year-old Greek anchor. And that Greek anchor weighed, well, put it this way, it needed 3 men to actually free the anchor from our anchor.
Wow.
So, you have all this going on. To add to it, maybe a third element of adversity is you've got all the Greek fishermen saying, "Be careful, you're going to run into our boat," and then you've got everyone else giving you a bit of peer pressure saying, "How on earth did you get in this stupid situation?" So all of these elements of adversity which are playing, and to give you, some thoughts on how we react to adversity, I think the very first thought when you get something like that is you panic.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And you absolutely panic. And what you've got to do is you've got to take a step back. And I think we mentioned that, as we were discussing, you've got to try and force yourself not to panic. Take a step back, not think about the worst, but look at what resources you have around you. You've got to do that fairly quickly. And there might be things you need to do to save the environment. And then you can respond a little bit slower. But whenever I have, a topic or an incident of adversity, I try and just, take a deep breath and just look around, assess the environment, look at the resources, and try and work out what is creating that adversity. And in this particular case, we managed to work out that we did a prop wrap that was quite simple. Freeing that was a little bit more difficult, but we knew we had someone who was good at an element of free diving, and he enjoyed it, because I don't, but he did. And then we had the incident with the anchor, and we realized that the only way we could get over that situation was to get a small boat into the water and to create what is effectively called an offload. So you offloaded the weight of the Greek anchor so that we could free our anchor up. And that whole incident took about an hour and a half. We managed to get a couple of ladies on the boat to calm the Greek fishermen down by putting fenders between the boats. So the last aspect I would bring to you is the fact that we worked as a team. And it was very important to recognize who you had available, marshalling the resources to their strengths to help you overcome. And then, we sailed on from that point, and we had a story which has been kept, with all my friends as one of the stories which always comes out at the bar, for the last 3 or 4 years.
Exactly. I was just thinking that.
But it's good because you build on that experience because,
it's a great metaphor, James, and I think again the younger leaders out there who are listening are saying, "Wow, James Hines panics." Well, yeah, everybody panics, right? And yet you have just described beautifully, how you then respond to it, and I think it's a great lesson. And of course, given that experience. Building satellites in which you're going through at OneWeb is nothing. I mean, this was the hard thing in your life. I want to ask you a question on that, though, because you really described a process for responding to something that really came out of nowhere. When you step back and you take that deep breath, I assume there's there's something that happens physiologically that you're able to do to control your thinking, your vision. Do you see the entire scenario of the solution, or were you sort of thinking stage by stage? Oh, we're going to have to get a boat. We're going to have to send our best diver down. Did the solution all come to you at one time, or did you sort of think it through step by step?
You know, I would say it's a combination.
Hmm.
Um, and I think you have to kind of like rise above it, the environment, the particular situation. You need to make a first call. Um, and the first call we had to make was the fact that we had an issue with the propeller. And so we thought that was the only issue. Um, and so we addressed that. But then as we addressed it, we realized that it wasn't the only thing which was stopping the boat moving forward. It was this other anchor, which had fouled
Yeah.
up with our anchor. So that's why I'm saying I try, and it's not easy. I really don't find it easy, but I try to just look at what are the facts which present at the moment. But often I found when you start to move out with what you perceive the solution to be, there's another problem which is lurking, in the background, which you also have to resolve before you can proceed at speed. And
Mm.
that's exactly what happened here. And I've seen it so many times in my career, how, you take that step back, you take a breath, you analyze, but then when you move out with a solution, you find something else. And I guess, Lou, for me,
Yes.
it's the importance that you don't have a static solution. You
Mm.
propose the best of your understanding, you move out with that, but you've got to be prepared that you might have to do something else to get to that final point.
Yeah. And again, that's a very adaptable mind at work, that you're describing. Um, James, we've got time for a last question here. And I really wanted to ask you, staying with this topic, because I find it fascinating in terms of dealing with adversity and leading. You're responsible for 300 or so folks, spread over 2 countries, as we described, overseeing an advanced satellite manufacturing facility in Florida. We described your goal, up to 2 new satellites a day, and this was unheard of in the classic satellite manufacturing world that I grew up in, and that you grew up in. Um, Speaking of things that may be lurking, is there something that is out there on the horizon in the logistics or some other type of obstacle, competition that you see, that you think you may have to deal with, and that you've sort of accommodated for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And part of my answer is going to pick up on a word you mentioned before, Lou, which is adaptability. Nothing
Hmm.
stays the same. And even though with our particular business, we want it to stay the same for as long as it can, because we have a challenge of making a lot of satellites, 2 orders of magnitude what people used to do in past years. So we have to do something which is more of the same as a bespoke, opposed to a bespoke design. And so, one of the real challenges there is making sure that you keep that machine running,
Hmm.
particularly if you've got to keep that machine running for a long time. And you've got to keep it running with a global supply chain. And not, of course, forgetting the fact that we have to launch the satellites as well.
Yes.
So, that's one of the aspects which really commands this need for adaptability. But you also mentioned a word which is competition. And, I've always worked in this particular industry of space. And as you mentioned at the very beginning, I've worked over 30 years. And when I've seen what has changed in those 30 years, it's absolutely amazing.
Oh, yeah.
I started my career with probably, I don't know, this second generation, maybe third generation. We're up to about the 8th generation where
That's right.
people, can really track it.
Hmm.
So, the reason I bring that up is I think, again, we have this dynamic rate of evolution. You can look at Moore's law, you can apply the Moore's law to what it means to your particular spacecraft, how electronics are getting smaller, so you can put more electronics on board. You can look at what's happening in the launch vehicle industry. Before we had the likes of Arianespace, ILS, ULA, but now it's completely changed, and our ability to get into space at a much greater and beneficial economic price point means you can get more stuff into space. So this has really given us good competition, because you've got other players out there who are also saying, well, the obstacles to entry are not quite as high as they used to be.
Right.
So to wrap up my response to you, it would be, we do see people out there who are competing, but I think competition is something which just hones your response, because it's a bit like an athlete. You're training for the Olympics. And if you haven't got that benchmark in terms of your competitors to reach and to overcome, then you're not pushing yourself. And that's something which I think we need to do, and not in a strong sense, but we need to recognize what the competition is and how we need to improve the product, the process, and give an even better deliverable point.
Yeah, I think that's again, that's well said. Just quickly, we didn't talk about it because we've run out of time. But the ground segment, I know your gateways are moving along; they're in place. I believe Kratos put in a lot of the antennas. Is that moving along as well? Because that's obviously got to match up with this new experience of a number of satellites and a big fleet in space.
It's a great question, but I will have to defer that question to my OneWeb shareholder, because the OneWeb shareholder looks after the ground segment. Just getting the satellites out of this factory and this organization is enough. But I think it's a really good question for OneWeb. I know that they're putting every bit of effort that we are in terms of making the spacecraft get out to bring their constellation to bear at the very earliest. But yeah, it's always, there's two halves of the big satellite system. The first is, of course, the satellites, but if you haven't got your ground segment, your gateways, your control segment, then of course you're not going to go very far. So yeah, they're pushing ahead with that, but they would be the right people to give you a response in terms of the detail on that.
Yeah, I thought you might say that. And of course, we speak with them as well. But as you say, you've got enough work to do just getting those satellites out. And I'm glad you got rid of that big Greek anchor too. That was a challenge. James, thanks so much for making the time. I know you've got a lot on your plate, and we really appreciate you coming by and talking about some things that really don't get talked about a lot with regard to risk and adversity. So thanks again. Thanks so much. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and please stay safe, everyone. We'll work through this together. Thank you.
You bet. Well, that concludes my conversation with James Hines, the new CEO of OneWeb Satellites. For more information on OneWeb Satellites, go to onewebsatellites.com. There's some great videos of the F6 satellite separation process and a whole lot more. Thanks once again to Kymeta, Mansat, and OneWeb Satellites, our sponsors for this second season of Risk. The Better Satellite World podcast is brought to you by SSPI and its corporate partners, EchoStar Hughes, Eutelsat, and Access Intelligence. Learn more about the Better Satellite World series at sspi.org and contact Tamara Bond-Williams at SSPI if you want to sponsor our next series, Space for All. And if you want to become a member of SSPI, again, go to sspi.org. If you're a student, your membership is free. To learn how to use this content, conversations like this with Mr. Hines for your classroom, social media, or presentations, visit bettersatelliteworld.com. And please follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. Keep checking SSPI for information about our March 23rd Hall of Fame induction ceremony. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care, everybody.